Welcome everyone to this launch of this white paper from the Hydrogen and Fuel Cell Supergen Hub, delivering negative emissions from biomass-derived hydrogen. This is the latest white paper from the Hub, and in a little while I'll tell you a bit more about the prior white papers and show you how you can download them at the end of the talk. My name's Nigel Brandon. I'm director of the H2FC Supergen Hub based out of Imperial College. Just to tell you very briefly then about the Hub before we start. The Hub's been running since 2012. We bring together the community across the UK in hydrogen and in fuel cells, undertaking transformational research to advance the field, but also informing stakeholders about the importance of this field and building networks across the community. And today's event is very much around informing stakeholders and building those networks. So it's great to have you with us today. Next slide, please. The Hub conducts research across the sector, across hydrogen and across fuel cells, but this is the 6th of a series of white papers that the Hub has produced. 4 are mentioned there, and these can all be downloaded from the website. Last week, we launched our latest white paper on UK industrial strategy opportunities for hydrogen and for fuel cells, and again, that report can now be downloaded. Okay, next slide, please. So it's a great pleasure to have with us the authors of the report and panel members who have had the chance to read the report and will comment on it. And in a moment, I will introduce our speaker, Dr. May Bowie. But before I do so, perhaps just a few housekeeping points. Firstly, that if you wish to have subtitles for the presentation, you can go to your settings and choose up to 6 subtitles: Chinese, Korean, French, German, Spanish, and Portuguese. Throughout the presentation and the comments from the panel members, you can submit questions. You can also if you wish, others' questions, and this will help raise the priority of those questions to be answered during the Q&A. Okay, so let's move on then and introduce our speaker for today. Introduce Dr. May Bowie. May is based in the Centre for Environmental Policy at Imperial College London, and her research brings together dynamic process modelling with carbon capture and storage, and particularly focusing on how these two things come together in pilot plants. She's experienced of doing this in Australia, in Norway, in the UK, and in Italy. So May is very well placed to speak to us about today's topic. So let me pass on to May for the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Nigel, for the kind introduction. So today I'll be giving sort of an overview of the insights that was gained from the analysis work that we did in this report, looking at delivering negative emissions from biomass-derived hydrogen. So I'd like to acknowledge the authors listed here. And great. So this provides an overview of the content inside the report. So I won't have time to cover every topic, and the focus will really be on this modelling analysis work that we did for the report, shown in sort of the green box here. So the technology that we're looking at is a technology called Bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, or BECCS, as it's often referred to. And the concept that's involved with this process is biomass, which grows and absorbs CO2 from the air during its growth, shown on the far left box. This biomass is then harvested and transported and processed into a fuel pellet. And this fuel is then converted into a fuel energy product, so using a bioenergy conversion process, which can make products like electricity, hydrogen, heat, biodiesel, and this process, this conversion process, results in some CO2, which is then captured and transported and stored permanently in geological formations. And this permanent storage of that CO2 results in a thing called negative CO2 emissions. Another term for this is carbon dioxide removal, or CO2 removal. So as you can see, each of the different steps requires an amount of energy and results in a small amount of CO2 emissions. So it's important to look at the overall supply chain and network to kind of look at the overall CO2 emissions to make sure that you're actually removing more CO2 from the atmosphere than you are emitting. So that's where life cycle analysis and supply chain network modeling is quite important. So this figure here shows you the different pathways that you can use to convert different biomass feedstocks. So each feedstock will vary in terms of its composition, and that means it varies in terms of its suitability for a given pathway. And you can see there's many different pathways. When combined with CCS gives you negative emissions, and it creates a different end product. The different pathways can result in different amounts of negative emissions because some of them, for instance, produce a carbon-based fuel. So, for example, biodiesel or bioethanol. These carbon-based fuels will then be combusted in maybe a car or a truck, and this results in re-emission of that CO2 back into the atmosphere. Whereas other pathways, which might produce sort of carbon-free products like hydrogen, don't release that CO2 back. So this is quite important, looking at the different pathways, and depending what type of feedstock, you will pick a certain pathway for that feedstock. So this is where a biomass supply chain model is quite important. So we have a model that we have developed within our research group called Monet UK, which is modeling and optimization of negative emission technologies. So it's a cost optimal supply chain network model, which minimizes the total supply chain system costs subject to a negative CO2 emission target. So you can see here, it takes into account all the different steps that you use to process your biomass to a certain fuel product, and then it takes into account different types of conversion pathways. So we've got a bioelectricity process, which takes a power plant to make electricity. You've got combined heat and power, which makes both heat and electricity. And then the last process is a gasification process, which makes the hydrogen process. So you can take into account the three different conversion processes and compare them and see which technologies are deployed. And in this model, we take into account sort of the geospatial distribution of where you grow the biomass and where you will actually build the different plants, so the power plants, the hydrogen plants distributed across the UK. The key input also is looking at the different feedstocks. So we take into account a variety of different feedstocks. We have two primary types of feedstocks that we look into, which are dedicated energy crops that you can grow in the UK based on sort of land yield. So we've got miscanthus and poplar, and then we also consider secondary sources of biomass, so wood residue, crop residue, waste wood, and municipal solid waste. And these secondary sources of biomass are cheaper in cost, and they also reduce the amount of land required because they're actually residues or waste that's usually discarded or thrown away. So you can repurpose this to use for energy. So this is all, the details of the equations are provided in the report. So if you'd like further information, please refer to the report. And I'll just kind of cover some of the key things that are inputs into the model. So the first part is looking at the UK land cover analysis. So we looked at the UK, and you can see the different types of land that is kind of distributed across the UK. You've got urban areas, you've got areas where there's bodies of water, mountain areas, and these particular types of land you can't actually grow any biomass on. So any land that you can't grow biomass is shown here in pink in this middle graph. So this is constrained out of the model, so you can't actually grow biomass. And the leftover land, so the grassland, marginal land, is shown here in green. So this total amount of green area that's available to grow is about 8.4 million hectares. But this also includes land that's used for agriculture as well as livestock grazing. So you actually have to deduct this from this total amount, and that's about 6.1 million hectares. So you're left over with a total maximum land available of 2.3 million hectares to grow your biomass on. And this number is actually comparable to other estimates. So for example, ETI have suggested about 1.2 million hectares being available for biomass growth. So we take this amount of land that is available and we multiply this by the energy crop yield. And the two crops in the UK that we look at, we've got miscanthus, which is sort of a grass type of feedstock, and then poplar, which is a woody-based type of feedstock. And these then, when you multiply, you end up with your biomass or bioenergy crop potential for the UK. We take that energy crop potential and we add that to the availability of waste and residues in the UK. So we've got two types of waste residues that we consider, which is the municipal solid waste and the waste wood. And both of these are distributed based on the population in the UK. And then we also have forest residues and crop residues, which is available based on where the forests are and also where the agricultural land is. So adding all of this together will then give you a total bioenergy potential for the whole of the UK. And this is then put into the model to show where you can actually grow and have biomass actually available. So the three technologies that I mentioned shown here is the techno-economic assumptions for each of these different technologies. So the first is the biomass-derived hydrogen with CCS, which makes your hydrogen product. It's considered here as being the most expensive technology because you've got it's a more newer technology, it's a lot more complicated, so it's the highest capex cost. It also gives you the highest sort of system efficiency. You've got then two other types. You've BECCS, which makes bioelectricity. This one here assumes a pulverized fuel supercritical power plant, which actually has variable efficiency depending on the feedstock type. So for instance, if you're using a high moisture content feedstock like MSW, you get a lower efficiency, 30% for the system efficiency. It has a sort of moderate price in terms of the capex, and then the cheapest of the three is the bioenergy for combined heat and power, which has the cheapest capex, but also uses a technology providing about 36% system efficiency. So this is showing the characteristics of the three technologies, which then get deployed in this particular model. So we have two approaches to looking at the deployment. The first part, we look at the optimal pathway to deploy the technologies on an individual technology basis. So here we deploy one technology at a time. So if we use all the biomass to use for one type of technology. So we calculate the average CO2 removal costs, the amount of energy that's generated, and the negative emission credit required to incentivize the investment. So this graph here can show you how much in terms of negative emissions can be delivered with all the different feedstocks in the UK. So from the left, you've got sort of the dirtiest fuel. So this is the municipal solid waste. And then you start adding on and removing more CO2 as you're using different types of feedstocks. So going from the left to the far right, this is when you've used all of the different feedstocks in the UK. So you've used all the crop residues, the virgin biomass, and this in total removes about 56 million tonnes of CO2 from the atmosphere, just using biomass sourced within the UK. So you can see that the UK has more than enough biomass to meet its negative emission target. So the target set by the Committee on Climate Change is about 47 million tonnes of CO2 removed per year, in order to meet its net zero target. So you can see that there's enough biomass. And if we look at the three different pathways using that biomass to produce different products. So in the orange, we've got the biohydrogen process. In the blue, it's the bioelectricity process. And in the green, it's the combined heat and power process. So on the left axis, we've got the average cost of CO2 removal shown with the solid lines. And then on the right axis, we've got the electricity generated equivalent shown with the dashed lines. And you can see that of the three technologies, the biohydrogen process results in the highest average cost of CO2 removal, which is not surprising because it's the highest capex technology. So it's 151 pounds per tonne of CO2 removed. And it also, when using that electricity to make electricity, it produces the lowest amount of electricity equivalent, so 37 terawatt hours. The middle moderate price is the bioelectricity price, which removes and at a cost of 146 pounds per tonne of CO2 removed and produces about 66 terawatt hours of electricity. And the cheapest of the three is the combined heat and power process, which has an average cost of CO2 removal of 131 pounds per tonne of CO2. And this, when you use the heat and combined with electricity, has about 87 terawatt hours of electricity equivalent. So when we see the different products in terms of making electricity, it's not a very fair comparison. So you really need to look at the actual energy vector, so the actual product that's generated and how much of that is produced. So we have them here on this graph shown the different types of products in terms of their actual type of energy. So for example, the biohydrogen process, you can make 74 terawatt hours of biohydrogen. So this is actually, instead of using it to make electricity, for example, if you use it for the transport energy, you can have about 11%, you can meet 11% of the transport energy demand in 2030. Alternatively, you can use all that biomass to make electricity, which, as I said, was 66 terawatt hours of electricity. That's equivalent to about 13% of the electricity demand in the UK for 2030. And then the last process makes that amount of electricity, and in addition to that, also 53 terawatt hours of heat. So this kind of shows you the differences in terms of how much energy vector, in the terms of the energy that's produced in those terms of those vectors, but the value of these will vary. And as you can see, the amount of energy revenue that you get for those different products is quite different. So for example, electricity, this can be sold for at a price of 85 pounds per megawatt hour, and this is based on the levelized cost of combined cycle gas turbines. The heat, the revenue you could get is potentially 36.4 pounds per megawatt hour based on the natural gas residential heating. And then lastly, you've got the hydrogen, which can be sold, for example, at today's market price, which is about 10 pounds per kilogram of hydrogen. But if we start using more hydrogen, it's projected that the cost of hydrogen will come down to about £1.40 per kilogram of hydrogen in 2030. So if you look at those different revenues, in addition to that, you need to think about the revenue you might get. So in terms of the CO2 removal revenue, this is the payment that you receive for removing the CO2 from the atmosphere, and this is called a negative emission credit. So we calculate this based on an internal rate of return of 15%. So we want to make an IRR of 15%, and so this is on a basis of pounds per tonne of CO2 removed. And this is shown here in this graph. So this is the negative emission credit that you need to actually get in order to make this, I guess, potentially economically viable. If you see at the current hydrogen market price, on the very bottom line shown here, you don't actually need any negative emission credit to make that project viable. It's already sold at a very high price. Alternatively, if you sell the hydrogen at a lower price of £1.40 per kilogram of hydrogen, you need a very high negative emission credit of 145 pounds per tonne. The moderate price would be the BECCS process, which makes bioelectricity, which requires a negative emission credit of 86 pounds per tonne, and the lowest credit required is by the combined heat and power process, which requires 32 pounds per tonne. So in this particular part, this part of the analysis, we've only assumed really one selling price for each of the products. And the question is, what happens if you vary the price, and also if you combine different technologies deployed? So rather than deploying one technology at a time, we can think about the cost optimal combination of the three technologies. So which of the three and how much of the three should you deploy in order to kind of have a cost optimal combination? And we look at that and combine that as well as looking at the different product prices and the effective product price. So we consider three different scenarios. The first is the base case scenario, which looks at the deployment of all three technologies as brand new greenfield plants. So building them brand new, all with the same capture rate. And so this is the same table as I showed you before. And so you can see, as I said, the biohydrogen process being the most expensive and BECCS being sort of the moderate price. And because sometimes that might inhibit its ability to be deployed, we consider this retrofit scenario where BECCS is cheaper because you use existing coal plants and convert that to burn biomass. So the retrofit BECCS scenario reduces the capex of the bioelectricity plant by 42%. The third scenario, where we think about trying to reduce the cost of the biohydrogen process, and in order to do that, looking at other analyses, you can see that it's really by lowering the capture rate that you can reduce the capex. So in one study, you could see that reducing the capture rate by 56%, rather than using a 90% capture rate, you can reduce the biohydrogen capital cost by 14%. So these are the three scenarios that we wanted to look at to see how the combination changes. So the first scenario, the base case, we see that across the price ranges that we look at, so we've got on the left the hydrogen price, and then the right the heat price varying, and then the bottom axis is electricity price varying. So across the product price range for this base case scenario assumptions, in no case do you deploy any of the bioelectricity plants. So it's not actually viable. And then if you consider looking at the combined heat and power, you can see that across most of them, so you can see blue is 0 and red is showing 100% deployment of that technology. So most of this graph is shown here in red, showing that most of the product price range, you're deploying combined heat and power. And so it had a similar cost in capital cost compared to the BECCS, but you're actually generating revenue from two products, electricity and heat. So this makes it shifts the economic viability towards the combined heat and power process. And then in one corner where you've got low electricity price and much higher hydrogen price, you see here in this region, the hydrogen process is much more viable. So you get more biohydrogen process in this product price region. So I won't talk about the negative emission price just yet. I'll wait till the end. So the second scenario, we've got the retrofit BECCS process. So here you've got a much lower capital cost for the BECCS process that makes electricity. And so what we see is when the electricity price is in the higher region and heat price becomes very low, in those regions you start seeing deployment of your retrofit BECCS plants. And still, however, most of the product prices, you see that the combined heat and power process is the preferred technology. And the trend for the biohydrogen process is basically the same. So again, high hydrogen price, low electricity price, you'll start deploying a lot more biohydrogen processes. And then for the third scenario, so we thought if biohydrogen was a bit cheaper, would that encourage the deployment? And what we saw was it didn't, because the capture rate of the process reduced. So we still don't get any BECCS in this under the deployed, and actually using a lower capture rate actually reduces the use of biohydrogen, because these technologies are designed to remove CO2. So you should actually be trying to maximize that CO2 capture rate, and it's more favorable to use a higher capture rate. And what we see when we're looking at the negative emission price is that there are lots of regions where you can become economically viable. So this is showing the negative emission price required to get an internal rate of return of 15%. In the regions that are dark red, this is where you actually need to pay a negative emission credit. In the regions that are light red and green and blue, these are regions where you actually receive money, so you can actually get revenue. So there's a fair bit of region where you can see that a lot of these product prices, you can get economically profitable scenarios. So in conclusion, we show that using the indigenous biomass in the UK, you can contribute 56 million tonnes of CO2 per year of CO2 removal without importing any biomass. Regardless of the pathways, all the technologies can actually contribute a material contribution to the decarbonisation targets for the UK. We show that biohydrogen can play a major role in a lot of the scenarios, and you can potentially produce about 74 terawatt hours of hydrogen, which is equivalent to 11% of the UK's transport demand in 2030. It's more cost effective to deploy the technologies alongside each other. So it's really important to look at the combination of the technologies rather than deploying one at a time. Thinking about flexibility of deploying multiple technologies, you could potentially have more profitable scenarios. So future research priorities should look at technology cost reduction, particularly the CapEx and OpEx, and thinking about energy efficiency and also maximizing the CO2 removal.
May, thank you very much indeed. And it's great to see the questions coming in. Please do continue to and like others' questions. While we do that, and while you continue to do that, it's a great pleasure to invite our two panel members. It's always customary in these white papers to give two experts the chance to read the report and then come and raise any commentary or questions or issues on it, and then to participate in the Q&A. And our first panel member is Dr. Matilda Fajadi. Matilda is in the Energy Policy Research Group at the University of Cambridge. Her PhD work was on the subject of BECCS deployment and its impact on the water-land energy nexus. So Matilda, over to you.
Hello everyone, and thank you, Nigel, for the introduction. And thank you, Mai, for the very clear presentation of the report. So in my perspective, two questions really motivated this report. The first one was, what are the techno-economics of biomass-derived hydrogen, which really came from a hydrogen standpoint. How can we produce hydrogen from biomass? What are the different pathways? And the second question was, how does biohydrogen and CCS compare with other bio-based negative emission pathways? And that question really comes from the biomass standpoint. We have a limited amount of sustainable biomass. That biomass could have a value for both CO2 removal and CO2 emissions mitigation because it produces low carbon energy. And so how can we use this biomass in the best way? So I think this question of what is the best value of biomass for both removal and mitigation is worth asking when considering the full range of bio-based negative emission pathways that Mai already touched a little bit upon in the presentation. So recently we have seen biohydrogen and carbon capture and storage being chosen as a preferred pathway in some national or regional level modeling exercises to sort of modeling exercises to net zero. For example, the recent UK Catapult Innovating to Net Zero report, or the California Getting to Carbon Neutral report, which virtually foresees to convert most of its residual biomass to hydrogen. So I thought I would use these few minutes to unpack a little bit the drivers of biohydrogen and CCS being a preferred pathway or not, and put the report results in a wider context. So the relative value of one pathway over another will very much depend on first how much CO2 removal can be achieved with 1 unit of biomass, and so that's something that Mai already explained in our presentation. So for example, bioelectricity and biohydrogen have a 90% plus capture rate and yield a carbon-free energy vector, as opposed to, for example, biofuel, which tend to exhibit lower capture rates between 15 to 55, 60%, depending on the process, and also exhibit an available carbon fraction, which remains in the energy product and will be re-emitted. It also depends on the range of feedstock that can be used for each process pathway. So large-scale bioelectricity plants might require higher quality fuel, such as a low moisture biomass, finely ground biomass, and that generally comes from wood pellets. While gasification is slightly less demanding on the type of fuels, or combined heat and power plants can also be a bit more flexible and get some waste biomass, etc. So ultimately, that wider range of feedstock can mean higher removal or mitigation potential. A third factor is I think a very important one that the report didn't cover enough, and that will be done as future work, is the sort of value of the energy product. So there's of course the economic value, so the value of hydrogen, the value of heat, which we in the report had a strong impact on which pathway was chosen, but also the systems value when accounting for systems integration effects, which is a function of the energy system. For example, but if you include bioelectricity in an electricity system model, it can really be valuable in the way that it provides firm and dispatchable low carbon power to balance intermittent renewables. hydrogen can provide storage. So this sort of system integration value have to be considered. And so this modeling work, I think integrating this sort of supply chain modeling with a wider energy systems model is currently being explored in the research group at Imperial, and I think it will be a very interesting follow-up to this report. And finally, I think other drivers of one path being preferred over other pathways can be the infrastructure which is needed. So typically hydrogen or heat need an infrastructure that electricity and biofuels don't need or need a bit less. The presence of alternatives or lack of alternatives, which can really the carbon abatement curve and make a pathway more profitable. And finally, some other co-benefits, which are not carbon or energy related, which can really make a pathway interesting. And I think these last reasons are really why other bio-based pathways, which don't lead to any energy production, can have a large mitigation removal potential. And that, for example, includes afforestation, which we have discussed a lot recently, biochar for soil remediation, which can lower fertilizer application, which is a strong driver of crop life cycle emissions, biomass substitution in industrial processes, such as the steel industry, which does not lead to negative emissions per se, but can really help decarbonize a hard-to-reach sector. And so to conclude, is BHCCS the best use of biomass? Yes, it can provide large amount of permanent CO2 removal as compared to other bio-based pathways. This is the best would very much depend on the relative value of hydrogen to decarbonize the economy, so transport, heat, and the cost of rolling out a hydrogen. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. And let me introduce our second panel member, Dr. Azelia Bown. Azelia is a director of E4Tech, a strategy consulting firm specializing in sustainable energy, as well as a principal research fellow in the Center for Environmental Policy at Imperial College. From his extensive experience in working in the bioenergy space, advising companies and governments on power, heat, fuels, and chemicals from biomass. Azelia, over to you.
Thank you, and thank you for the invitation to provide some comments. First of all, I must say I enjoyed reading the report. I think it stimulates thinking around the topic of bioenergy and CCS, so well done to the team. And I found particularly interesting the integrated analysis of different bioenergy with CCS options. So looking at them together and in the way that has been presented in a report, I think generates some useful thinking. So on to some more specific comments. Hydrogen and CCS are two increasingly probable components of our energy system, given the scale of the decarbonization challenge, the attractiveness of hydrogen as a fuel, and the need for negative emissions. So I think it is a very timely and topical report in that sense, as both hydrogen and negative emissions are becoming more and more prominent in the debate. The report presented illustrates the attractiveness of biomass, as it can produce not only an attractive energy vector like hydrogen, but at the same time deliver potentially much needed negative emissions. And I think this combination is critical and very attractive in the case of biohydrogen with CCS. However, because of the significant systemic and infrastructure changes needed for the widespread use of hydrogen and CCS, this transition to biomass hydrogen and CCS will take time and will face challenges. And I think there's probably three challenges in particular that will determine a little bit whether this option proves to be a viable one in the future. And I will just go briefly through these three right now. So firstly, I think as long as there is a need for carbon-containing fuels, for example, in shipping and aviation, would it make more sense to use biomass to produce these fuels? So, for example, produce a synthetic kerosene through a Fischer-Tropsch process to replace fossil jet in aviation. And we know that these sectors like shipping and aviation will be difficult to decarbonize and will be reliant for a long time on fossil fuels. Hence, in the short to medium term, maybe the direct production or the production of carbonaceous or carbon-containing fuels may be the viable option or the most interesting option for biofuels, for biomass. Secondly, hydrogen from electrolysis via renewables such as wind and solar may become quite cheap in the future, projections in the order of $2 to $4 per kilogram. And there are options for negative emissions that may also be relatively low cost, although DAC costs are expected to be of the potentially greater than $150 per ton of CO2, which are in the order of the negative emission credits calculated for biomass hydrogen with CCS in this report. So this begs the question: will these options, so electrolytic hydrogen and other greenhouse gas removal options like DAC, be preferred to produce both hydrogen and negative emissions longer term compared to biomass hydrogen with CCS? Finally, biomass hydrogen with CCS will also be competing with biomass electricity and heat with CCS, as illustrated in this study. And ultimately, it will be the level of demand and willingness to pay for negative emissions that will determine its attractiveness. So just with these 3 points, final 3 questions, I'd like to thank you, and I also look forward to the questions and to the discussion. Thank you.
So, Azelia, thank you very much indeed. So let me introduce my co-chair, Dr. Piero Presizio. So Piero will be doing her very best anyway, to field the questions. She works in the CCS area and looks at various mitigation technologies and low carbon transition technologies, and particularly looking at the socio-economic benefits of energy systems decarbonisation. And also just to mention that Dr. Niall McDowell will be joining us. Niall is a co-author of the report. He's a reader in energy systems at Imperial College, and he's joining us in case his support and help and contribution can be used to answer the questions. So Piero, over to you.
Many thanks, Nigel. So, well, we got quite some questions from the audience. I tried to group them in terms of what are more, let's say, more similar in terms of themes. It seems like the most likely question rely mainly on the biomass assumption that has been made in the modeling process. So perhaps Mathilde can help us clarify some question with regard to the feedstock that have been used. So first of all, if you have considered any potential impact on land, so in your modeling, with regard to the land use impact or the impact on biodiversity, and also if you have made any assumption with regard to the land availability in the UK for the future, or if this has been kept constant through the periods. So Mathilde, over to you.
Yes, thank you, Pierre. And if yes, if I make any mistakes, please do correct me on this point. So I think we were trying, or the main modeler of this work, Zhang, was trying to be as conservative when it comes to biomass. And ability with the catapult availability results, which span from sort of 0.6 million hectare today to up to 1.2 million hectare of land available in by mid-century. So these are the numbers that we ended up using for land availability. The second question was the other impacts such as biodiversity. So by using land which is not used for food and not has any sort of grassland or forest on it, we sort of trying to circumvent the idea with the problem of competition with biodiversity food production. Obviously, there might still be impacts that we can't plan. That's why we're trying to be conservative in the way that we not considering that a lot of this land is for bioenergy production. I think there was a question on, I think these are the two main points in terms of land availability in the future. So we are assuming that we have more available and counterintuitive, but as the demand for bioenergy increases, you can assume that some land may be available for bioproduction. And we also assume higher yields in the future for energy crops.
Okay, great. Many thanks, Mathilde. The next range of questions were related more on the modeling, also on the methodology that you have taken for the process of converting biomass to hydrogen. So these were mainly related to the cost and the emission analysis. So perhaps what emission have been like if a full cycle emission had been actually conducted, for instance, with regard to the emission related to the infrastructure requirements and the storage as well. And again, also related to the infrastructure, whether the model considered the cost of building the pipelines for the hydrogen, of course. So perhaps, I don't know if any of you from the panel would like to answer these questions. Otherwise, maybe Mai would be the best to answer to this.
So in terms of the emissions analysis, this was a supply chain model which really focused on sort of the carbon footprint that was associated with the biomass. So the sort of harvesting, growth, transport of the biomass, all the emissions of that was taken into account. In terms of the emissions associated with building the infrastructure, that was not considered. So it's kind of assuming, because it's a mix of processes that we used existing plants. So for example, retrofit of power plants and so forth. So we didn't actually include the emissions associated with building infrastructure. In terms of the costs, all of the costs of building infrastructure was taken into account. So building the plants, the transport infrastructure for the biomass supply chain. In terms of the products that were generated, we didn't have that part included. So that infrastructure was not. So it was really focused on sort of the biomass and making the product, but we didn't actually take into account the supply side. So this is because it's purely going to be based on sort of demand profiles, which we didn't actually have because the different products, there isn't actual demand for hydrogen, for instance, compared to electricity and heat. So it wouldn't be a fair comparison. So until we have those sorts of accurate sort of demand profiles, then you can start building a model that looks on the supply side. So that part was not taken. So I think that covers the question, Piera. Was there anything I missed in that question?
Yes, absolutely. And also, so then following up on this, maybe also another question that was popping up was quite interesting with regard to the potential research and development area with regard to the biomass to hydrogen processes that you might think are needed in the future, specifically with regard to maybe biomass conversion or specifically with regard to these routes. So if any of you maybe would like to take this, it's more of a general question, let's say. Well, then maybe perhaps.
Piera?
Yes?
Yeah, maybe I can say a brief word on that. So we did quite a lot of, we did quite an extensive set of sensitivity analyses on the whole on the modeling work to try and get some understanding of this. And one thing came out sort of again and again, one thing consistently came out as being really, really important in this, and that was the yield of the biomass. So how much biomass you can produce per hectare of area, because there are quite a few comments, you know, I think mentioned earlier, and also in the questions around competition for land, competition for food, blah, blah, blah. If you can maximize the yield of biomass per hectare of area, all of the system costs tend to fall as a result. So anything we can do to maximize yield, I think, is a really good thing to prioritize.
Great. Well, thanks a lot, Niall. Then maybe another question also related to this route is how about this route in comparison to other potential hydrogen production routes, especially considering that the land in UK is quite scarce. So why do you actually, do you or any of you think that biomass gasification is the promising route for hydrogen other than other potential routes?
So I'll jump in with this question. So we actually did a pretty extensive literature review before carrying out the analysis. So if you refer to the report, you can kind of see us going through the different technologies, so both the biological pathways, so looking at fermentation and comparing that against the thermochemical pathways. So like, for example, pyrolysis, the different technologies, it ends up being, in terms of the technology readiness level, the gasification process has a slightly higher TRL than all the other processes, and also on top of that, you want to combine capture and storage technology with that. So gasification allows you to do that. So in terms of the ability to put on carbon capture and storage, that was the technology that could kind of easily allow that for you to do that. And producing hydrogen at large scale was also important. So whilst biological pathways potentially more environmentally benign, they're still quite small scale, pilot scale, and more regional solutions potentially for local areas. But in terms of maximizing that hydrogen production, it's a bit more difficult to ramp up.
Thank you, Mai. Anyone that would like to add something maybe on this?
Maybe it's Auxilio Bowen here. Maybe yes, I can comment on that as well. I think ultimately, I mean, we know that there are sustainable sources of biomass that can be used and that can make a significant difference to the future energy system. The question is, what types of applications will they be pulled into? And that was really where I was trying to get to a little bit with my questioning. And ultimately, it seems that hydrogen and CCS is a very attractive one, but you will have to have a reasonably high willingness to pay for the negative emissions, as well as probably to some extent for the hydrogen, and probably that option then in that case will only be, so the biomass hydrogen with CCS option in that sense will only be pursued when we have significant hydrogen demand, when we have a lasting negative emissions and large negative emissions demand, and when we don't have maybe that opportunity to maybe more cheaply or more directly reduce emissions through biomass use in a carbon-containing fuel or through the direct use of heat. I think in this analysis, heat came out as something very interesting in terms of a comparison, both in terms of bioenergy with CCS, but also in terms of, well, how does this combination of hydrogen plus electricity plus heat and CCS compare to maybe a direct use of the biomass in heating and industrial uses, and how long will that heat demand be there?
Thanks, Auxilio. Well, this actually brings me to another more general question with regard to the other routes for hydrogen, which is if any consideration with regard to the utilization of hydrogen has been attempted, or if the report actually comments on that or make more general suggestions also with regard to the utilization of hydrogen rather than storage. So perhaps maybe Mai again can follow up on this.
In terms of utilization of hydrogen or the CO2, do you mean, Pierre?
Sorry,
yeah. Sorry?
Yeah, the CO2 utilization, yeah.
Yes, yeah. So we didn't actually touch on the utilization of CO2 in this work. I guess there's definitely a lot of interest on the CO2 utilization. However, I guess one aspect that I kind of mentioned earlier about sort of making carbon-based sort of products that, let's say you make use the CO2 to make a diesel or fuel, that then gets burned and then re-releases the CO2 back into the atmosphere. So the main work here is focused on negative emissions. So in terms of utilization, you won't really sort of remove that CO2 from the atmosphere. So there's definitely lots of interest. It potentially is a way to kind of maybe create a monetary stream that, you know, helps incentivize CCS. But for large scale mitigation of CO2, it might be quite challenging. In a lot of the life cycle analysis work, at best you can probably be maybe carbon neutral, and that's, you know, very, very ambitious assumptions that are kind of being implemented in those cases. But I guess maybe perhaps Niall has some comments on this in terms of the utilization aspect.
Thanks, Mai. I think probably better off to keep the focus on the hydrogen side rather than the carbon utilization side. I don't think that we thought about that at all, as you say, in this study.
I think maybe just a quick comment from Auxilio Bauer here again. I think this is an interesting question, CO2 utilization versus CO2 storage. If you utilize the CO2 and through that utilization you displace fossil emissions in the system, your net impact compared to storage may be the same. Hence, that begs the question: is it worth you know, going through the hassle of producing something with that CO2 as opposed to just storing that CO2 in economic terms? I think that's an interesting question, and I think something that will probably be discussed much more, I think, in the near term.
Oh, okay. Can I bite on that now, Auxilio, since you've gone? So I think it's interesting. I mean, it's, you know, this displacement point is really interesting, and I think in this context it's important to distinguish between, let's say, CO2 utilization where the source of carbon is fossil versus CO2 utilization where the source of carbon is atmospheric, i.e. you're using like a direct air capture technology, and then finally the source of the CO2 utilization where the source of carbon is biogenic. So we've got this biomass-derived CO2. So building on all of the comments and concerns that are in this conversation and just, you know, ubiquitous, given the scarcity of bio-derived CO2 and the well understood importance of removing CO2 from the atmosphere to deliver the net zero and 1.5 degree targets, I would personally argue that it's almost a misuse of biologically derived CO2, which has resulted in removal of CO2 from the atmosphere, to turn that into anything other than a product that results in the permanent sequestration of that carbon from the atmosphere. So, for example, if you want to take bio-derived CO2 and use that to carbonate an industrial waste or something like that, which in turn gives you a product which you can sell and make money from, okay, that makes sense in my view, because you've then permanently removed the CO2 from the atmosphere. So you've maximized the utility of the biological CO2. Sorry, excuse me. You've maximized the utility of the bio CO2, and you've also permanently removed it from the atmosphere. If, however, you do the bio CO2 route and then you convert it into a fuel, and then that bio CO2 goes back into the atmosphere, it is, you know, carbon neutral insofar as that goes, leaving aside the upstream carbon leakage concerns, but you don't achieve the goal of removing CO2 from the atmosphere. So I think source matters in that context.
Thank you, Niall. Maybe perhaps another question that is popping up on the biomass parts was actually whether any scenario on imported biomass was taken into account for the model for Monet. And if not, if that would actually make sense, and what would be the value of considering the potential disruption of the supply chain, the local supply chain for the UK. So perhaps again, Mathilde, that's a question for you.
Sure. So in that particular report, we really focused on indigenous biomass. So we didn't look at imports. That being said, that model has been used for different applications, also considering import scenarios. I do think that some countries may have a more established biomass supply chain with more established sustainability practices, which would actually end up in a lower carbon-intensive biomass, even accounting for transport to the UK. So I do think imports can make a lot of sense. What we see in our report, in some results that we obtain using Money UK with imports, is that imports tend to be used at the beginning when lower land, when we have less land available for bioenergy production, and as we ramp up the UK bioenergy production with higher yield, namely, then we start decreasing the amount of imported biomass and focus on indigenous biomass. So I think imports can play a different role. It's more about international carbon accounting and certification rules, which are the key bottlenecks here.
Great. Well, thanks a lot, Mathilde, for the answer. So I think that we probably need to wrap up now. I think yes.
If I can make just a final point, because I think that this is an important one, and to build on what Mathilde just said, which is absolutely correct. I think that, again, insert what's also almost become cliche about the need for a sort of a green restart to the post-COVID economy and so on. It is well understood from everything from the IPCC through the ETI and the CCC that greenhouse gas removal via biomass sources, it is going to become imperative to delivering, all of the various climate targets that we have. In this context, recognizing this tension between maximizing the utility of the indigenous potential, so indigenous bioeconomy, versus using what's already there in terms of the global trade in bioenergy. What's really important is that decision makers at all levels of government and governance maximize the value creation and value retention that are associated with these new opportunities. So I think that needs to be really thoroughly taken into account, and in a much broader way, rather than something as simplistic as it costs me X pounds per ton for local biomass and half of X to import it, therefore we should import it. There are broader questions to address.
Well, thanks, Niall. Well, I couldn't agree more. Thank you. If anyone else had any other remark that you would like to make. Well, another question that was that has been asked is if this presentation is going to make published and available. So perhaps I don't know, Nigel, maybe.
Yeah. Why don't I come in at this point? Thanks a lot. And I think actually we are out of time, and it's great to see so many questions coming through, so I appreciate it. I hope what this has given you is a taster for actually reading the full report, and indeed all of the slides and all of the content of this presentation can be found in that report, and the report will be available to download from the Hydrogen and Fuel Cell Supergen website on the conclusion of this webinar, so I encourage you to look to it. I'd like to thank the authors of the report, the panelists, my co-chair, and all of you for attending the launch of this. You can follow the Hub on Twitter. You can send us, and please do send us any feedback, and there's an email address there. So thank you very much for everyone's participation today, and that will bring the webinar to a close. So thank you very much.